This is Chapter 8, Section 1, Religion Sparks Reform. This section's objectives is first, to describe the new religious movements that swept the United States after 1790. 2. Explain the new philosophy that offered an alternative to traditional religion. First, we're going to look at the Second Great Awakening. And what was it? It was a spiritual reform from within that started in the 1790s. Before the 1790s, religion, and particularly Christianity, was more of this Calvinistic belief that God predetermined one's salvation or damnation, or if they're going to go to heaven or hell. In other words, if you were born, before you were born, it was already predetermined that you were either going to, when you die, go to heaven, or you're going to go to hell. And that was it. You had no control over that predetermination. Well, the preachers or evangelists of the Second Great Awakening preached salvation, that you can do good deeds in life and be able to control your own salvation to go to heaven. So how did people do this during this time? They would work to do good deeds. And that would turn into what you see next here, social reforms and the redefining the ideal of equality. What were some of these? First was temperance that we're going to look at here. We're not going to look at it too much here, but temperance means to refrain from the use of alcohol. Second, asylum and penal reform. Asylums are mental hospitals. Penal reform would be the reform of prisons and how we treated those that are incarcerated. Next, which we'll look at in depth in the next few sections, is abolitionism, and that's simply the movement to abolish or end slavery. Also women's rights, and then reforms in education, where it's going to start right here in Massachusetts in the 1830s and 40s with the taxpayer-funded public education. The rise in popular religion, if you look at a quote here from Alex de Tocqueville. In France, I had almost always seen the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom pursuing courses diametrically opposed to each other. But in America, I found that they were intimately united and that they reigned in common over the same country. Religion was the foremost of the political institutions of the United States. And that's Alex de Tocqueville in 1832. Because of this reform impulse here from the Second Great Awakening, we're going to look at this pursuit of perfection in antebellum America. This map here shows this benevolent empire. Why is it called this benevolent empire? It's a movement of these revivals during the Second Great Awakening. These preachers or these evangelists of these revivals would travel around the country and host these different revivals. And some of these preachers became quite famous. This district is called the Burned Over District, and the reason it was called that was that there were so many revivals that went on there. They were so intense, and they were called the Burned Over District because of the religious fires that frequently burned there. Now we're going to look at, before we do that, here's a nice lithograph of a revival meeting. Revivals could last a couple weeks for a family. Charles Grandison Finney, when he preached, his listeners shrieked, moaned, and fainted. He was the most famous preacher of the era. He inspired emotional religious faith using a speaking style that was as much high drama as prayer or sermon. His duty as a convert was to spread the word about personal salvation to others. This religious activism is known as evangelism. If you look at this quote on this slide here, it reads, "The ranges of tents, the fires reflecting light, the candles and lamps illuminating the encampment, hundreds moving to and fro. The preaching, praying, singing, and shouting like the sound of many waters was enough to swallow up all the powers of contemplation." And Finney's type of sermons was known as this soul-shaking conversion. Not everyone would turn to religion that was reform-minded. Many would seek an alternative to traditional religion, but found revivalism too public a forum for religious expression. So they turned to transcendentalism. It's another term or American term for European Romanticism. It was the liberation from understanding and the cultivation of reasoning. It transcended the limits of intellect and allowed the emotions, the soul, to create an original relationship with the universe. Transcendentalism was a philosophical and literary movement that emphasized living a simple life and celebrated the truth found in nature and in personal emotion and imagination. If you look at the transcendentalist thinking, first, man must acknowledge a body of moral truths that were intuitive and must transcend more sensational proof. First, the infinite benevolence of God. Second, the infinite benevolence of nature. Third, the divinity of man. They instinctively rejected all secular authority and the authority of organized churches and the scriptures of law or of conventions. Therefore, if man was divine, it would be wicked that he should be held in slavery, or his soul corrupted by superstition, or his mind clouded by ignorance. Thus, the role of the reformer was to restore man to that divinity which God had endowed them. Who were some of the two we're going to focus on? They're right out of Concord, Massachusetts. First was Ralph Waldo Emerson. Some of his more famous works in the transcendental tradition was Nature, published in 1832, Self-Reliance, published in 1841, The American Scholar in 1837. Henry David Thoreau, who was basically a student of Ralph Waldo Emerson, wrote the famous Walden. You may have heard of Walden Woods in Concord, Massachusetts. The resistance to civil disobedience. Henry David Thoreau is I guess you could say, the godfather of nonviolent protestation. The transcendentalist agenda was to give freedom to the slave, give well-being to the poor and the miserable, give learning to the ignorant, give health to the sick, give peace and justice to society. A critic of the transcendentalist, you might have learned about this author, or read some works from this author, was Nathaniel Hawthorne. He believed that their pursuit of the ideal led to a distorted view of human nature and possibilities. He also believed one should accept the world as an imperfect place. You may have read The Scarlet Letter or The House of the Seven Gables. Now, I have a closing question for you. Put in your notebook. And here's the question I want you to be ready to discuss when we get together in class. What monumental changes were influencing the religious-based reform movement in America? So what else was going on? What influenced this? Why were people turning to religious revival? And therefore, these reform movements. And we'll talk about that next class. Thanks for watching.